The Zeridian dreadnought materialized at the edge of human space like a dark, geometric wound in the fabric of reality. Commander Elena Torres stood frozen on the bridge of the UES Aegis, her eyes locked on the massive holographic display. The alien vessel dwarfed her flagship, Earth's Pride, by at least 20 times. Its surface was an impenetrable obsidian, absorbing all light that touched it, broken only by faint purple energy signatures that pulsed along geometric patterns. "Comms are receiving a transmission," announced Lieutenant Yuri Katsaros from the communications station, his voice wavering slightly. "It's broadcasting on all frequencies. Universal translation algorithms are processing now." Elena nodded, her dark eyes never leaving the image of the dreadnought. Around her, the bridge crew worked with practiced efficiency, but she could feel the undercurrent of tension. The Aegis was humanity's most advanced vessel, the flagship of Earth's exploratory fleet, and yet, faced with this alien monstrosity, it suddenly seemed fragile. The transmission cleared, and a voice like grinding metal filled the bridge. "Attention, inhabitants of Sol and surrounding systems. This territory is now claimed by the Zeridian Empire. You have 3 Terran months to evacuate all planets, moons, and stations. Those who remain will be exterminated. There will be no negotiation." Silence fell across the bridge. Elena's hand tightened on the back of her captain's chair, knuckles whitening. 3 months to abandon Earth. Mars, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn where millions now lived, and the 4 frontier systems beyond, where humanity had just begun to thrive after generations of sacrifice. "Commander," Lieutenant Katsaros spoke again, his voice steadier now. "Earth Command is patching through. They want us to respond." Elena straightened her back. The United Earth Federation had spent centuries dreaming of first contact, preparing protocols, training diplomats. None of that planning had included an evacuation ultimatum. She took her seat in the command chair and nodded at Katsaros to open the channel. As the face of Admiral Wren appeared on her private screen, Elena recognized the burden in the older woman's eyes. This decision, humanity's first official response to an alien civilization, would echo through history. "Commander Torres," Admiral Wren began, her voice deliberately controlled. "You're our forward presence. The Security Council is divided. Some advocate immediate compliance to save lives. Others insist we must stand our ground." "What are your orders, Admiral?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. "The Council wants your assessment of the threat, and they're authorizing you to deliver our initial response." Elena's breath caught. In that moment, she felt the weight of billions of lives. "The threat is real, Admiral," she said after a moment. "Their technology is beyond anything we've encountered, but evacuation is impossible, not just logistically, but fundamentally. Earth is our home. The colonies are our future." Admiral Wren nodded slowly. "Then deliver our answer, Commander. Make it clear, but leave room for diplomacy if possible." The transmission ended, and Elena rose from her chair. The bridge crew watched her with a mixture of fear and determination. They were explorers, scientists, and pilots, not warriors. But in this moment, they had become humanity's first line of defense. "Open a channel to the Zeridian vessel," she ordered. Lieutenant Katsaros worked his console. "Channel open, Commander." Elena stood tall, her voice firm as she spoke words that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. "This is Commander Elena Torres of the United Earth Federation vessel Aegis. We acknowledge your message, but we cannot comply. Earth is our ancestral home, and our colonies represent generations of human sacrifice and achievement. We will not abandon them. We are open to establishing peaceful relations and discussing territorial boundaries, but we will defend our worlds if necessary." She paused, then added, "Earth is our home. We do not flee." For several long seconds, there was no response. Then the massive dreadnought began to move, turning away from the Aegis in what seemed like dismissal. "They're powering engines," reported the sensor officer, "accelerating out of the system." Are they leaving? Someone asked hopefully. Elena shook her head, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. No, they're going to prepare. She turned to address the bridge. And so must we. Within hours, Elena's response had been transmitted across human space. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. On Earth, protests erupted outside government buildings, some demanding surrender to save lives, others calling for immediate military action. In the frontier colonies, a different sentiment prevailed: grim determination. These were people who had already risked everything for a new beginning. They would not be uprooted again. The Aegis returned to Earth at maximum speed, and Elena found herself thrust into the center of a political maelstrom. The Security Council chamber was packed with representatives from every major Earth nation and colony world. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Elena delivered her report. The Ziridian vessel's technological capabilities exceed our most advanced systems by an order of magnitude. She concluded, their energy signatures suggest weapons that could potentially sterilize a planet's surface. However, their ultimatum itself gives us an advantage: time. General Samuel Cho, Earth Defense Force's highest-ranking officer, rose from his seat. His weathered face reflected decades of military service, though he had never faced an enemy like this. Commander Torres's assessment confirms what our analysts feared. He stated flatly, "We face an existential threat with superior technology and unknown numbers. The only rational response is immediate militarization of all sectors. Every ship must be retrofitted for combat. Every mining station must be converted to produce weapons. Every civilian with technical skills must be drafted for defense work." Senator Arya Malik of the Mars Confederation stood in opposition, her elegant frame belying her fierce intellect. General Cho suggests we prepare for a war we cannot win. The cost in lives would be astronomical. We should instead use these 3 months to evacuate our most vulnerable populations to hidden locations while dispatching diplomatic missions. The Ziridians have shown they're willing to give warning. This suggests the possibility of negotiation. The debate raged for hours, with Elena watching as humanity's leadership fractured along predictable lines: military versus diplomatic, Earth versus colonies, immediate action versus careful planning. Finally, she requested to speak again. The Ziridians gave us 3 months not out of mercy, but convenience, Elena said, her voice cutting through the chamber. It's easier for them if we evacuate ourselves, but their ultimatum reveals something important. They want our worlds intact. This means we have leverage. She activated a holographic display showing the Sol system and its 4 colonized neighboring systems. I propose a 3-part strategy. First, we prepare our populations for conflict while beginning limited evacuations of non-essential personnel from the most vulnerable outposts. Second, we convert our infrastructure for defense, focusing on technologies that might counter their capabilities. And third, we attempt contact again, not to surrender, but to understand our enemy. The council chamber fell silent as her words sank in. It wasn't optimism she offered, but a pragmatic path forward. Commander Torres, Admiral Wren said finally, the Security Council will need to deliberate. But, in the meantime, you're being given operational authority to begin implementing defensive measures in the frontier systems. The Aegis will be your flagship, with additional vessels assigned to your command. Elena nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. The political debate would continue, but Earth was preparing for war, and she had just become its first combat commander. The following weeks saw the most rapid mobilization in human history. The Aegis, once an exploratory vessel, had its scientific equipment replaced with prototype weapon systems. Mining stations across the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter converted their excavation equipment into makeshift artillery. Research outposts began analyzing the limited sensor data on Ziridian technology, searching desperately for weaknesses. Elena established her command on Elysium Prime, the most developed of the frontier colonies. From there, she coordinated defense preparations across 4 star systems, all while knowing that their efforts might be futile against the overwhelming force they'd witnessed. 28 days after the ultimatum, the first Ziridian scouts appeared near Hestia. the outermost human colony. Elena immediately deployed a squadron led by the UES Defiant to intercept. Maintain position beyond their sensor range, she ordered Commander Jackson of the Defiant. Observe only. We need intelligence more than confrontation at this stage. But the Zeridian scouts detected the human vessels and moved to engage. What followed was humanity's first skirmish with the alien empire, a brief, brutal encounter that ended with 2 human ships destroyed and 1 Zeridian scout disabled. The remains of the alien vessel proved invaluable. A salvage team managed to recover fragments of its shield technology, a sophisticated energy barrier unlike anything human scientists had theorized. Dr. Ravi Hossein, the Aegis's lead engineer, began immediate analysis. The principles are completely novel, Hossein explained during a briefing in the Aegis's converted laboratory. His dark eyes shone with a scientist's fascination despite the dire circumstances. They're not just deflecting energy, they're phase-shifting it into another dimensional state. Can we replicate it? Elena asked. Dr. Hussein's expression was grim. Not in 3 months, maybe not in 3 years. But he hesitated, then continued with cautious optimism. We might be able to create a disruptor that interferes with their field coherence. It wouldn't give us their shields, but it could potentially weaken theirs. It was the first glimmer of hope, however faint. On Earth, the political situation deteriorated further. Senator Malik had gained support for her position favoring negotiation, while General Cho's militaristic approach was backed by Earth's largest nations. The division was becoming dangerous, threatening to undermine the unified response Elena knew was essential. 42 days after the ultimatum, Elena was summoned back to Earth for an emergency council session. The journey gave her time to prepare her arguments, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited. The council chamber had been converted into a war room. Holographic displays showed defense preparations across human space, but also something new: refugee ships, thousands of them, being prepared in orbital shipyards. What is this? Elena demanded as she entered. Admiral Wren looked haggard, aged years in the weeks since they'd last met face-to-face. The council has approved a partial evacuation plan. Senator Malik's coalition won the vote. Evacuation to where? Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. Beyond the frontier, into unexplored space. Admiral Wren's voice was hollow. Ships are being prepared to carry up to 20% of our population, mostly younger citizens, scientists, cultural leaders. A lifeboat for humanity, they're calling it. Elena felt a surge of anger. So we're giving up, after 6 weeks of preparation? Not giving up, came Senator Malik's voice as she approached. Ensuring survival. Your military efforts continue in parallel, Commander, but we must be realistic. Realism would be focusing all our resources on defense, countered General Cho, joining them. His uniform was impeccable, but deep lines had formed around his eyes. Every ship used for evacuation is one not fighting to protect our homes. Elena looked between them, the diplomat and the soldier, and recognized that neither alone had the answer. And in their conflict, precious time was being wasted. Both approaches have merit, she said carefully, but they must be coordinated. The evacuation ships should be our last line of defense, not our first. They should remain in reserve until we've exhausted our military options. The tension in the room eased slightly as both Malik and Cho considered her words. A compromise. Admiral Wren nodded. The evacuation fleet prepares but does not launch unless absolutely necessary. Meanwhile, Commander Torres continues defensive preparations with our full support. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And progress was what humanity needed most. Elena returned to the frontier with new resources and authority, but also with a heavier burden. The political compromise meant she now carried responsibility not just for defense, but potentially for the survival of the human species itself. 60 days after the ultimatum, halfway to the Zeridian deadline, the real invasion began. It started not with the massive dreadnought they'd first encountered, but with dozens of smaller vessels, still each larger than the Aegis, appearing simultaneously across human space. The coordinated attack suggested extensive pre-planning. The Zeridians had been studying humanity's defenses during the warning period. New Hope Station, a research and mining facility carved into a massive asteroid in the Tau Ceti system, became the first major battleground. Elena had foreseen its strategic importance and reinforced it with 3 military vessels and Dr. Hussein's prototype shield disruptors. The battle that followed would later be known as the Siege of New Hope, a desperate 12-day struggle that would define humanity's resistance. Elena arrived with the Aegis on the 3rd day, after receiving distress calls. The scene that greeted them was chaotic. 2 Zeridian vessels methodically bombarding the asteroid facility while human ships darted between them, launching missiles that dissipated harmlessly against alien shields. "Status report," Elena demanded as the Aegis took position behind a smaller asteroid for cover. "New Hope's outer defenses are breached," reported Lieutenant Katseros. "They've fallen back to the inner tunnels. The Zeridians have landed troops, some kind of mechanized units. Our people are fighting them in the corridors." Elena studied the tactical display. A frontal assault would be suicide. But the station's labyrinthine interior, carved through decades of mining operations, offered an advantage. Humans knew the territory, the invaders did not. "Deploy our Marines to reinforce the station defenders," she ordered. "And get me Dr. Hussein." The engineer appeared on her screen, his lab clearly having suffered damage. "Commander, we've installed 3 disruptor emitters throughout the station, but they're not having the desired effect. The Zeridian shields are adapting faster than we anticipated. What if we modulate the disruptors, random patterns instead of sustained frequencies?" Dr. Hussein's eyes widened. "That might work. Their adaptive algorithms would have to constantly recalibrate. It won't bring down their shields entirely. But it could create momentary vulnerabilities." "Momentary is all we need," Elena replied. "Coordinate with tactical. I want those disruptors synchronized with our weapon systems." The battle for New Hope Station became a brutal test of human ingenuity against Zeridian technological superiority. The station's defenders used their knowledge of the tunnels to ambush the mechanical Zeridian troops, while Elena's ships executed hit-and-run attacks against the orbiting vessels. Dr. Hussein's modified disruptors proved the turning point. When activated in a randomized sequence, they created split-second weaknesses in the Zeridian shields, just enough for precision strikes to penetrate. After 9 days of relentless fighting, one of the Zeridian vessels suffered critical damage and withdrew. The second followed a day later. It was humanity's first victory, costly but vital for morale. Nearly a third of New Hope's population had been lost, along with one of Elena's ships and hundreds of Marines. But they had held. As Elena walked through the station's battle-scarred corridors, surveying the aftermath, she received an unexpected transmission. The Zeridian commander requested direct communication. The alien that appeared on her screen was not what she had expected. Humanoid in basic shape, but with scaled skin of deep blue and eyes like liquid silver. Its voice, though translated, retained a metallic quality. "I am Admiral Kethrin of the Zeridian Imperial Fleet." It stated, "You have displayed unexpected tactical adaptability." Elena maintained a neutral expression. "This is Commander Torres. Your attack on a civilian research station violated civilized principles of warfare. Warfare has begun because you refused evacuation." Kithrin replied, "The consequences fall upon your leadership." "We defend our homes," Elena countered, "as any sentient species would." "Your resistance is futile but noted. The deadline stands. Prepare for escalation." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Elena with the cold certainty that the Siege of New Hope had been merely a preliminary test. The Zeridians were assessing human capabilities, probing for weaknesses, and now they would bring their full force to bear. She was right. 75 days after the ultimatum, with just 2 weeks remaining before the deadline, the second Zeridian fleet arrived. This time, there was no pretense of limited engagement. Multiple dreadnoughts, each the size of the first one they'd encountered, appeared in formation throughout human space. The orbital bombardment began immediately. On Artemis III, a terraforming colony in the Epsilon Eridani system. 2 million civilians had minutes of warning before kinetic projectiles punched through the atmospheric shields. Within hours, the surface temperature rose by 30 degrees, rendering the carefully balanced ecosystem uninhabitable. Similar attacks struck outposts across the frontier, not planet-killing blows, but precise strikes against infrastructure, particularly power generation and life support systems. The message was clear: the Zeridians could make these worlds uninhabitable without destroying them. On Earth, panic ensued. The Security Council convened in permanent emergency session. The evacuation ships, once controversial, were now being filled beyond capacity. Senator Malik's faction gained dominance as military options seemed increasingly hopeless. Elena, now coordinating what remained of the Frontier Defense Forces from the Aegis, received new orders. Fall back to the Sol system. Protect Earth at all costs. She stared at the directive for a long moment before responding, "Acknowledge receipt of orders. Will comply when current evacuation operations complete." It was dangerously close to insubordination, but Elena couldn't abandon the colonies while civilians were still being evacuated. For the next 3 days, her diminished fleet ran a desperate defensive action, drawing Zeridian fire while transport ships escaped the bombardment zones. When she finally ordered retreat to Sol, barely half of the colonial populations had been evacuated. The rest were either dead or stranded on increasingly hostile worlds. The knowledge would haunt her forever. The Aegis limped back to Earth with a fleet of battered vessels and civilian transports. The ship's hull bore scorch marks from near misses with Zeridian weapons, and her crew was exhausted from weeks of combat operations. But they had saved thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, who would otherwise have perished. Earth itself was now frantically preparing for what seemed inevitable. Orbital defense platforms, hastily constructed during the 3-month warning period, formed a protective ring around the planet. The combined navies of Earth's nations had been integrated into a unified defense force under General Cho's command. Civilian bunkers were being stocked with supplies for a prolonged siege. But fear permeated everything. Humanity had witnessed the Zeridian capabilities and found them overwhelming. Many believed the approaching deadline would bring extinction. Elena found herself summoned not to the Security Council, but to a smaller, secure facility beneath Geneva. There, she found Admiral Wren, General Cho, and Senator Malik waiting, the triumvirate now directing Earth's response. "Commander Torres," Admiral Wren began without preamble, "you've seen the Zeridians in combat more than anyone. Based on your experience, do we have any hope of defending Earth?" The directness of the question struck Elena like a physical blow. She considered her response carefully. Conventional defense, no. Their technology outmatches ours in every category. But New Hope Station proved they're not invincible. If we can't match their strength, we need to target their weaknesses. "What weaknesses?" General Cho demanded. "Their shields adapt to our weapons. Their hulls withstand our most powerful impacts. Even our nuclear arsenal would be ineffective against their dreadnoughts." "Their weakness isn't technological," Elena replied. "It's strategic. They want our worlds intact. That's why they've used precise strikes rather than planet killers. And from my communication with Admiral Kethrin, I believe they underestimate us. They see us as primitive, unworthy of respect." Senator Malik leaned forward. "You spoke with their commander. Why wasn't this reported?" "It was in my filed reports," Elena said evenly. "But it was brief. He contacted me after New Hope to assess us, I believe, to understand why we wouldn't simply surrender." Admiral Wren's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And what did you conclude from this interaction?" "That the Zeridians are methodical and arrogant. They follow protocols and expect certain outcomes. When we disrupt those expectations, as we did at New Hope, they become vulnerable, at least temporarily." General Cho scoffed. "Psychological insights won't stop their bombardment." "No," Elena agreed, "but they might help us plan a counterstrike." She activated a holographic display showing the inner solar system. "The Zeridians have been systematically moving inward from the frontier. Based on their patterns, They'll likely establish a forward position in the asteroid belt before advancing on Earth. She highlighted the region between Mars and Jupiter, where millions of asteroids orbited. That's where we make our stand, not in orbit around Earth, where we'd be defending a fixed position, but among the asteroids where we can use the terrain to our advantage. The three leaders exchanged glances. It was Admiral Wren who spoke. "What exactly are you proposing, Commander?" "A trap," Elena said simply. "One that targets the core of their technological advantage." She turned to Admiral Wren. "I need Dr. Hussein and whatever resources we can spare, and I need them immediately." 4 days before the Ziridian deadline expired, the massive alien fleet appeared at the edge of the solar system. True to Elena's prediction, they established their forward position in the asteroid belt. 3 dreadnoughts and dozens of smaller vessels formed a blockade, preparing for the final advance on Earth. Behind them, the 4 frontier systems that had represented humanity's first steps into the galaxy now lay in ruins, not destroyed, but rendered temporarily uninhabitable. Exactly as Elena had suggested, the Ziridians wanted the planets intact. On Earth, the final evacuation ships prepared to launch, vessels bound for distant, uncharted regions of space, carrying the seeds of human civilization. Senator Malik supervised their preparation personally. Though she had refused to place aboard, she would remain with Earth to the end. General Cho had deployed his unified fleet in Earth orbit, a last line of defense that all knew would be insufficient against the Ziridian armada, but it would buy time for the evacuation ships, if nothing else. And in the asteroid belt, hiding within a hollowed-out mining asteroid, the Aegis and a small flotilla of vessels waited. With them was humanity's final, desperate hope, a device that Dr. Hussein called simply the Pulse. "It's not elegant," the engineer had explained during the frantic days of construction. "Essentially a massive electromagnetic pulse generator, but modified based on what we learned about Ziridian shield technology. It won't destroy their ships, but it should temporarily disable their sensors and communications. Perhaps their weapon systems too, though that's less certain." "How temporary?" Elena had asked. "Minutes at most. Their systems will reset quickly. Minutes might be enough." Now, as she stood on the Aegis's bridge watching the Ziridian fleet take position, Elena fought to control her own fear. Everything depended on timing, on the Ziridians behaving as expected, and on Dr. Hussein's device functioning as theorized. So many uncertainties, so many lives at stake. "Commander," Lieutenant Katsaris reported, "the Ziridian fleet has completed its formation. They're beginning to move toward Mars orbit." Elena nodded. "Signal the flotilla. Battle positions." The plan was audacious to the point of madness. While the Aegis remained hidden with the pulse device, the other ships in Elena's flotilla would launch a seemingly desperate attack against the Ziridian blockade. The goal wasn't to win, that was impossible, but to draw the dreadnoughts into a specific position. What followed was a ballet of destruction. The human vessels, many piloted by volunteers who knew the mission's suicidal nature, executed perfectly coordinated attack runs against the Ziridian formation. As expected, the alien vessels responded with overwhelming force but remained in disciplined formation, exactly as Elena had observed in previous encounters. "They're so predictable," she murmured, watching the tactical display. "So rigidly adherent to their protocols." The battle raged for 20 minutes, with human ships falling one after another. The survivors executed a strategic retreat, drawing the Ziridian vessels into pursuit and into the trap. "They're in position," reported the tactical officer. "All 3 dreadnoughts are within the target zone." Elena took a deep breath. "Activate the pulse." Deep within the hollowed asteroid, Dr. Hussein's device hummed to life. Energy levels climbed rapidly as it prepared to release its electromagnetic charge, not in a single burst, but in the randomized pattern they had discovered worked against Ziridian shields. "Pulse at 90%, reported Dr. Hussein from engineering. "Be advised, when we activate, all our systems will be affected too. We'll have approximately 30 seconds to reboot before the Ziridians." "Understood," Elena confirmed. "All personnel, secure for temporary system failure. Prepare for immediate action upon reboot. The bridge crew strapped themselves into their stations. Emergency lights switched to battery power. Pulse activation in 3, 2, 1. The device released its charge, an invisible wave of electromagnetic energy that expanded outward at near light speed. As it passed through the Aegis, all systems went dark. Emergency lighting flickered and died. For a moment, there was only the sound of breathing in the darkness. Then, one by one, systems began to reboot. The bridge displays flickered back to life, though many showed error messages. Outside, the Zeridian vessels drifted. Their purple energy signatures darkened. "Status report," Elena demanded. "Sensors at 40%, came the reply. "Weapons systems rebooting, engines online but at reduced capacity." The Zeridians, their systems appear completely offline. The pulse worked. Elena didn't allow herself even a moment of celebration. "Signal all remaining vessels. Execute Phase 2, now." The surviving ships of Elena's flotilla, having rebooted their systems, emerged from hiding places among the asteroids. They converged on the largest Zeridian dreadnought, the one Elena believed contained Admiral Kethrin. Without their shields, the Zeridian vessels were suddenly vulnerable. Human weapons, designed to deliver maximum impact in the brief window of opportunity, struck with devastating effect. "Target their propulsion systems and sensor arrays," Elena ordered as the Aegis joined the attack. "Disable, don't destroy." It was a crucial distinction. Elena wasn't seeking to annihilate the Zeridian fleet, an impossible goal, but to cripple it sufficiently to force negotiation. To demonstrate that humanity could not be easily conquered, even by vastly superior technology. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Human vessels, knowing this was their only chance, pressed their attack with reckless courage. Zeridian systems began to come back online, but in a staggered, uncoordinated fashion that left them vulnerable to the concentrated human assault. The flagship dreadnought suffered the most damage. Multiple strikes penetrated its hull, targeting what Elena's analysts believed to be its central reactor, not to detonate it, which would have destroyed everything in the vicinity, but to force emergency shutdown. "Commander," Lieutenant Katsaros called out, "we're receiving a transmission from the Zeridian flagship. It's on all frequencies." "Put it through," Elena ordered, her heart pounding. Admiral Kethrin's voice filled the bridge, the metallic quality more pronounced than before. "Commander Torres, you have surprised us. Our flagship is compromised. We request cessation of hostilities to prevent catastrophic reactor failure." Elena exchanged glances with her bridge crew. It was the opening they had fought for. "I accept, on condition of an immediate withdrawal of all Zeridian forces beyond the orbit of Neptune, and the opening of formal diplomatic negotiations." There was a pause, long enough that Elena feared the gambit had failed. Then, "Agreed. A temporary armistice while terms are established." The human vessels ceased fire. Around them, the damaged Zeridian fleet began emergency repairs, but also started a slow withdrawal toward the outer solar system. Elena allowed herself to breathe normally for the first time in what felt like hours. "Signal Earth Command, inform them of the armistice and request diplomatic personnel." The immediate crisis had passed, but Elena harbored no illusions about the challenges ahead. The Zeridians had agreed to negotiation only because they were temporarily disadvantaged. Once their fleet was repaired, the balance of power would shift again. Yet something fundamental had changed. Humanity had proven itself not merely stubborn, but dangerously resourceful. That would carry weight in the negotiations to come. 3 days later, representatives from Earth met with Zeridian delegates aboard the still damaged dreadnought. The location was symbolic, neutral territory created by the battle itself. Senator Malik led the human delegation, with General Cho providing military expertise. Elena attended as the architect of humanity's defensive strategy. Admiral Kethrin represented the Zeridian Empire. In person, he was more imposing than his holographic image had suggested. Nearly 7 feet tall, with ceremonial markings etched into his scaled skin. "Your resistance was unexpected," he stated without preamble. "No species has successfully opposed an imperial expansion in 12,000 years. Perhaps you've been encountering the wrong species." Senator Malik replied diplomatically. "Your adaptation to our shield technology was ingenious," Catherine continued, focusing on Elena. "Particularly given your limited resources and knowledge." Elena maintained a neutral expression. "Necessity drives innovation, Admiral." The negotiations were tense and protracted. The Zeridians, despite their setback, maintained a position of strength and knew it. Yet the humans leveraged their demonstrated tenacity and the Empire's desire for intact worlds. After 5 days, a fragile agreement emerged. Humans would retain Earth and the Sol system, while the Zeridians would withdraw beyond a defined boundary that included the damaged frontier colonies. Those worlds would remain uninhabited by either species for 50 years, a buffer zone. It wasn't victory. The colonies that had represented humanity's expansion were lost, at least for generations. Millions had died. But Earth itself, humanity's ancestral home, was secure. And a precedent had been established that humans would not surrender without extraordinary resistance. As Elena prepared to return to Earth aboard the Aegis, Admiral Catherine requested a private communication. "Your tactic with the electromagnetic pulse was unexpected," he said, silver eyes studying her. "Our analysts believed your technology incapable of such adaptation." "We're frequently underestimated," Elena replied. "A tendency the Empire will correct in its assessment protocols." Catherine paused. "The treaty established today is unusual in Imperial history. You have earned a unique status." "Equal parties to negotiation?" "Not equal," Catherine corrected, "but worthy of consideration. It is unprecedented." After the communication ended, Elena stood alone on the observation deck of the Aegis, watching as Earth grew larger in the viewport. The planet seemed impossibly fragile from this distance, a blue marble suspended in darkness. And yet its inhabitants had just faced extinction and emerged intact. The cost had been enormous. The frontier colonies, Elysium Prime, New Hope Station, Artemis III, and dozens of smaller outposts lay in ruins. Millions had perished in the conflict. Earth itself was scarred by panic and the frantic militarization of its society. Recovery would take decades. The evacuation ships, now recalled from their journey into uncharted space, would need to be repurposed for reconstruction. The balance between military preparedness and civilian needs would require careful management. And always, beyond the newly established boundary, the Zeridian Empire would be watching. The armistice was fragile, the peace uncertain. But humanity had proven something essential, not just to the Zeridians, but to themselves. Faced with an ultimatum to flee or die, they had found a third option. They had stood their ground, adapted to an overwhelming threat, and forced recognition of their right to exist. As the Aegis docked at Earth's orbital station, Elena was greeted by Admiral Wren. The older woman's face showed the strain of the past months, but there was pride there too. "Welcome home, Commander," she said, embracing Elena briefly. "They're calling you the savior of Earth down there." Elena shook her head. "No one person saved us. It was collective will that made the difference. Scientists like Dr. Hussein, leaders like you and Senator Malik, soldiers who sacrificed everything. Nevertheless, you'll be expected to give a speech." Admiral Wren said with a hint of amusement. "The public needs heroes after what we've endured." Elena nodded, understanding the symbolic importance even if she rejected the individual credit. As they walked together toward the station's conference room where officials waited, she asked, "What happens now?" Admiral Wren considered the question. "We rebuild, we prepare, and we remember." "Remember what?" "That we're not alone in the universe, and that our survival depends on both strength and wisdom." She paused at the entrance to the conference room. "The Zeridians will return eventually. Perhaps not for conquest next time, but they'll return. We need to be ready, not just with weapons, but with a unified human civilization worth defending. Elena thought of the words she had spoken at the beginning of the conflict, the declaration that had crystallized humanity's defiance. Earth is our home. We do not flee. Those words held truth, but they were incomplete. In facing extinction, humanity had discovered something more profound than mere stubborn resistance. They had found a collective courage that transcended individual fear, a willingness to stand together against overwhelming odds. As Elena entered the conference room to face the leaders of Earth, she carried that knowledge with her. The Galactic Empire's first war with humans had ended not in conquest or evacuation, but in a fragile recognition of humanity's right to exist. It was a beginning, not an end. And in the vastness of the galaxy, beginnings were precious things indeed.